Der nun kommende Vortrag von Yael Ohana, damit befinden wir uns wieder auf der internationalen Ebene, findet auf Englisch statt, weshalb wir nun auch für den Vortrag und soweit möglich für die anschließenden Fragen auf Englisch wechseln. Bitte stellt die Fragen, wenn möglich, auch direkt auf Englisch ins Kommentarfeld, dann tun wir uns leichter und müssen sie nicht on the spot übersetzen. And now we will switch to English for the upcoming keynote speech. Please welcome with me Yael Ohana, an international expert in the field of youth and non-formal education. Yael has been actively engaged in the youth field for more than 20 years in different roles and in different organizations. Currently, she is working at the Open Society Foundations in Berlin. Her keynote is titled Youth in Europe, Participation and Citizenship in and After COVID Times. A warm welcome at our online Open Youth Work Conference, Yael, and talk to you later with the questions.
Thank you, everybody. I hope that you can all hear me, and please do give me a sign if I'm speaking too fast. So Stephanie was so kind as to introduce me briefly. If I may just say thank you very much for this invitation, and I'm very sorry that it turned out not to be possible for us to meet in person in Perg in Austria. I would have enjoyed that very much, but at least we have technology. So I'll skip right away to my first remarks because Stephanie already introduced me. I would like to just, before we get into the subject matter, I would like to make 3 remarks related to just relativizing this very large title, Youth in Europe, Youth Work in Europe, COVID, and Citizenship and Participation. This is an enormous field. And if I might say that youth and youth work are really very, very big ideas. And we need to be careful, and I would like you to keep this in mind during the remainder of my remarks, that neither of these terms or concepts or ideas are monolithic or unified. Both are highly diverse between, but also inside each of the countries across Europe. And young people, their organizations and youth work structures that work with them have all been affected and are all responding to this new crisis, COVID-19, in really very different and very diverse ways. So these remarks would just preface my next points. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about youth, Europe, and the crisis and COVID. I think we are faced at the moment with the question of whether or not we're talking, whether or not we will be challenged by the needs of a pandemic generation, whether that is, a lost generation, I think remains to be seen. But I think there are 3 things that we can already very much and very clearly see coming out of research about and around young people in the pandemic. One is that the situation of young people around Europe and the world has become so much more precarious as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in obvious and less obvious ways. The reality of a growing proportion of young people is that of what we might call disrupted transition, not even stalled transitions, but really disrupted transitions, serious disorientation. Their education has been interrupted. Their employment prospects have become poorer. They are experiencing negative psychosocial effects as a result of lockdowns and forced isolation, and they have reduced access to resources, and the support structure and infrastructure that they would once have had access to is under serious pressure. And furthermore, the vulnerability of some of the most at-risk young people has been exacerbated and even worsened by the pandemic situation. And policy does not seem to be able to sort of keep up with this kind of crisis moment. We've heard something about this already from other speakers. So just to illustrate, and I do know that the OECD has a bit of a penchant for a kind of more economic or financial kind of approach to its analyses. But young people are maybe less at risk in terms of developing severe physical health symptoms linked to COVID-19 than the older age cohorts might be. But the disruption to their access to education and employment opportunities as a result of what we already see as the economic downturn is definitely putting this young generation on a more volatile trajectory in finding and maintaining quality jobs and income. And this is a quote from a study that was conducted last year by the OECD entitled Youth and COVID-19 Response, Recovery and Resilience. But just to say that, while the physical health symptoms might be less worrisome for young people, the mental health and well-being symptoms resulting from the pandemic are definitely very, very serious, and for a large number of young people. And there are, multiple intersections at which these risks take place, and gender is definitely an issue there. So if we now turn to sort of looking at the situation in the context, that situation of young people in the context of what youth work is traditionally expected to deliver in terms of offers to young people, and in terms of especially citizenship and participation, I find a useful definition of youth work is contained in the Council of Europe Youth Work Portfolio. It states, this is only an excerpt of the fuller definition of youth work, but it does say that youth work is a tool for personal development, for social integration and active participation of young people. And one of the main objectives, or the main objective of youth work, is to create opportunities for young people to shape their own futures. And if we look at, if we take this definition as a kind of basis, a kind of common ground, already 3 European youth work conventions have identified that these aspects of what youth work is for are really common across, pretty much every youth work context across the European continent. So we might consider this the European consensus around our professional field of youth work. These aspects of youth work are extremely important, and the question has to be asked in which way youth work has been able to still deliver these offers and these aspects of youth work in the COVID situation. So here, I think you have, again, from the Council of Europe portfolio, you have a nice illustration of what youth work is for, and especially in relation to aspects like citizenship and participation. I think this diagram really encapsulates something like the results that can and should come about for young people if and when youth work is able to fulfill its mission. And as I said, the question is really whether or not youth work has been able to fulfill its mission during COVID. I think, if you look at the education result, we might be able to say that youth work has been, we might be able to say that education, formal education, although with challenges, has been able to, take quite a lot of its work online. Youth work has done an enormous job of work to get fit in terms of making digital offers. But with regard to all other of the 6 E's, the question is really whether or not this is possible to deliver, these results are possible to deliver without the face-to-face dimension, which has, is really so much part of the DNA of youth work, and which has had to be put on hold for a good part of the COVID times. We know now with with various moments of opening up, youth work institutions have been able to offer alternatives with hygiene concepts and so on, but with each successive lockdown and with each successive wave of COVID-19, it's becoming harder and harder for that face-to-face dimension to have its sustainable identity and agency impact for young people, for their value orientations, in a way that really is, how would I say, that really is, present and accountable for the rest of their lives. So if we look a little bit at, maybe a bit of evidence around the situation of youth work in the COVID pandemic, we are really fortunate to have the results of the RAY research project and its special study on the effects of the pandemic on youth work across Europe. It also says something about, and it is, RAY has also been able to generate some evidence about, the situation of young people as such in the COVID pandemic. But I'd like to focus on the situation of youth work because it really highlights, I think, 4 extremely important negative consequences and effects of the pandemic for youth work that we will have to struggle with for a very long time, much like we are still struggling with the effects of the 2008 economic crisis. We're talking about the fact that literally everything has changed. Youth work spaces and formats and methods have had to adapt really quickly. And although youth work is experimenting and adapting and responding very fast, nevertheless, there's a certain catch-up involved. And not everything has been possible. Not all of the usual offers that are available to young people through youth work have been possible during the COVID crisis the last 2 years. Probably a very important element here is that not only has the work had to change, but actually the amount of work that can be done has become significantly reduced because budget allocations, private funding, paid work, sources of income, and volunteering time have been cut significantly. And youth work is, as a result, having a really hard time to reach out to its usual, but also its most important target groups, or reaching marginalized young people, and so on. Make no mistake about it, this is not the fault of youth work, right? It's definitely not something that youth work alone experiences. If you take a country like Germany and you take the field of formal education, we can see that they're having the education system is having a seriously difficult time, living up to the basic demands of providing education for just, regular education for young people across the board. And we're looking now at the potential of a very large generation of dropouts. In Germany alone, in 2020, the number of school dropouts doubled, and I'm saying doubled. So there are some major concerns here. One of the first and foremost major concern, I think, for youth work is that, is social distancing. So for many young people across Europe, the local youth center and the youth work activities of NGOs and charities, they're a lifeboat and an escape from daily dangers. Social distancing means that many of these activities are suspended, and young people in such situations are locked in without alternatives. And the face-to-face interaction and encounters, living and working together, the collective dimension of youth work, they're all central to its DNA. The fact that relationship building, the development of collective identities and collective action, and so on, when young people don't meet, what happens to those? So the second major concern definitely has to be, we've been able to identify it again through research, is digital readiness and the digital divide. Youth work institutions and providers are still a long way from having the necessary technological coverage, concepts and practices for delivering youth work pedagogy online. And that is as much to do with the fact that the institutions are under-resourced, don't necessarily have the competence, or slow to respond, as it is to do with the fact that young people, and especially marginalized young people, do not necessarily have access to the technology that they would need in order to take up those offers. And a third major concern has to be the fact that young people are generally excluded from decision-making about pandemic measures in general, right? But also directly, those pandemic measures directly relevant to their own existence, whether that's school, youth work, or other aspects of their lives. There is little specific research on the effect of the pandemic on young people's participation in citizenship per se, but there are a number of clear and obvious and frankly problematic trends that we can see already emerging. And these are that indeed, young people's possibilities for participation in decision-making around the pandemic response, especially in regard of youth-specific issues, are limited, if they're existent at all. There is a general closing of the civic space observed over the last years across Europe, also for youth civil society, and that has escalated. And some governments are using the pandemic emergency measures as a ruse to pursue an ongoing authoritarian agenda, despite the fact that the emergency may be over. And finally, young people, youth movements and organizations and youth work organizations have raised their concerns loudly in the crisis and understand the pressing need for policy advocacy, but they're not necessarily being heard, right? They do not necessarily have the access or the clout to get that kind of traction that they would need to help young people to raise their voices more sustainably. So youth work definitely needs more support across Europe, from the European agenda, but also from national agendas, and in the context of the interaction between the two. So you may have heard a little bit about the European Youth Work Agenda during the conference, and this is a space where possibly the interaction between national policy and European approaches, European programs and funding could really have an important impact on supporting youth work through this new crisis. I mean, frankly, the discourse on intergenerational solidarity has largely been a one-way street, right? Young people are the ones, in the media view, in the public discourse, there's been a lot of talk about how young people are spreading the virus with irresponsible behavior. But the idea that there is also an intergenerational solidarity going in the other direction, that current generations of politicians, of policymakers need to think about the longer term impacts for current generations and future generations of this pandemic, seems to be largely missing. And the demands on youth work to adapt fast and to deliver in the emergency have been fulfilled. But, the other side of the equation, there hasn't been that much coming back in terms of support for youth work to actually deliver, the good work that it knows it can do and that it is asked to do to address the pandemic. This is what we already know 2 years in. So youth work in Europe, I would say, is very much at an impasse. We must all, youth work as a profession, I believe, as a field of work, it must always be attuned to the challenges of the time, and it must adapt to its circumstances and environment. And yes, this new normality of lockdown followed by opening, followed by lockdown, followed by opening, may no longer be an emergency, but there will be no return to old normality, right? To the old normality of youth work before the emergency. Now that youth work has actually adapted, will it ever have the luxury of going back to doing things the old way? Our previous video message talked about, creating again more opportunities for physical meeting, for physical mobility. It's frankly very unclear to me, observing the policy discussion, whether or not this is really something that will be A, possible, B, desirable, and see whether or not governments and institutions who hold the purse strings will be willing to make those kinds of investments in the immediate and midterm future. And this is really the crux of youth work's dilemma and the risk it runs currently. Youth work really needs to remain true to its mission, and this means it must continue to provide three basic offers: personal development, social integration, and active citizenship to young people. And I see a number of things that youth work will have to do in order to be able to navigate its way out of this impasse and to survive in this new COVID reality. I think the first thing is that we need to understand, as a professional field, we need to understand that service provision, i.e. addressing, adapting, making sure that we do the things that the political elites want us to do in order to address the emergency. We have to understand that it can become a trap. The funding that comes with service provision rarely comes without strings attached. With the coming economic recession, the one that actually is already here in many respects, it will for sure become necessary again to fight for youth work's place among essential social services. Having done a good job on COVID response will not save youth work from major budget cuts when the politicians have to make the hard decisions. The second point is that we need to understand that the digital cannot address all the consequences of social distancing for youth work, and new and alternative approaches to youth work delivery will need to be developed to compensate for the absence or the missing face-to-face element, and for the fact that digital cannot fill those gaps. Youth work providers will need to adapt beyond the digital to survive. Third, I think we need to, as a field of work, we need to accept that there is a political dimension to this discussion that relates to emancipation, participation, and democracy, not just of young people, but in many respects, the status of youth work as an advocate for young people and for their rights. Youth work is a place where young people can and should be discussing and negotiating their visions of a society, of their societies, and what they want to do about those visions and how they want Europe to be in the future, what kind of society Europe should represent and pursue. In Europe and in European youth work, this has often been discussed in terms of the future of European integration. But the shrinking space of the space for progressive youth civil society can and will be accelerated by authoritarian governments that are no longer willing to give up the powers they clawed back from the EU or domestically. Youth work needs to support young people to stand up for their basic rights associated with democracy and work towards the reinstatement of all fundamental freedoms after the crisis. So I think the role of youth work as an advocate for young people's rights and for their emancipation and for their active citizenship in a democracy is something that is quite contested, and especially in the context of the emergency, it is often something that that youth work, let's say, it is not necessarily the highest priority given. It's not given the highest priority necessarily by youth work providers, and this can have risks for the future. And finally, although it's not specifically related to COVID as such, but it is definitely related to this impasse that youth work finds itself in. Youth work always has to remain relevant to young people's lives, and it's quite difficult to put this into words. But the question of planetary survival, safeguarding acceptable living conditions for humanity, which may not be, which are put at danger because of climate change. We have to think about how that aspect, which is so important for young people today, is being developed as part of those basic offers that we talked about before of youth work: personal development, citizenship development, and social integration. And this is not entirely clear. I mean, the occasional campaign on climate change is not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a complete reconceptualization of youth work offers, so that this sustainability dimension is really a visible and actionable dimension of the work that we do. So those are essentially the things that I think youth work will have to grapple with in the future. Actually, they'll have to grapple with it now, and that will be essential in youth work being able to navigate its way out of this COVID pandemic, out of this new emergency and crisis, and in so doing, at the same time, support the citizenship and participation of young people going forward. And just to end, I often quote Noam Chomsky from The Common Good when talking about this question of young people's emancipation, young people's place in society, and their status in this kind of political field of work. The smartest way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow very lively debate within that spectrum. And this is not what we want European youth work to become, but what it risks if it doesn't deal with this impasse that it is currently facing. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.